Over the weekend, the 2024 Olympics was kicked off with a performance by drag queens openly mocking the famous Last Supper imagery, showing us once more that Christianity is allowed to be publicly scorned in the once Christian West. Many took to the internet, including famous fitness coach and known lesbian Jillian Michaels, who called for the LGBTQIA2 plus community to show tolerance and respect towards the 2 billion Christians offended by the performance. Although Michael's call was a kind gesture, many correctly pointed out that the sexual pride community is done pretending that they are tolerant. They have successfully taken over the culture, and they are now taking yet another victory lap to insult those that they've conquered. Yet, in the shadows of all this, Christians and their allies have had several cultural wins that show a possible turning of the tides. The question now becomes, do Christians and their allies have what it takes to truly win, or will we snatch defeat from the jaws of victory? On this episode of Forge and Anvil, I will be joined by Wesley Todd to discuss that very question. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war that we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, just doing my best to represent him well wherever I go. As I mentioned in the intro, I am joined today by Wesley Todd. So Wesley, go ahead and say hello to the audience and give us a quick, brief bio about yourself for those who are not yet familiar with who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on, Connor. Really appreciate it. Like you introduced yourself, I as well, husband, father, follower of Jesus. We're actually on vacation, so I'm broadcasting now from my in-laws' spare bedroom. Some of you might know me from Right Response Ministries. So on Wednesdays, myself, Michael Belch, and Joel Webben do a live stream. I also have a good friend of mine, Lucas Curcio, at Method Ministries. I record with him sometimes as well. So those are two things that I really typically do. As far as convictions, as far as everything we talked about culturally, right there alongside with you. Christians have to be involved in the culture war. I saw someone's bio on Twitter and it said, you best start believing in culture wars because you're in one. It's kind of a little riff off Pirates of the Caribbean. And so culture wars matter because people matter. There are real victims, real people that are impacted by it. So excited for this discussion, excited to be talking too about what the LGBTQ community, which what they're focused on, which is winning. They actually want to win. They actually act like they want to win. And so looking forward to this discussion about how we as conservatives and Christians especially can do that.
As am I. Well, welcome on again, Wesley. And thank you, listener, for joining us. Before we get started, go ahead and check out our Substack if you haven't already, forgeandanvil.substack.com. You can find all the episodes of the show posted there as they are released on podcast platforms. And of course, I do occasionally post some written material as well that you can find there. There's an option for you to send a little tip in the tip jar as well if you feel inclined. Like and share this video to boost us in the algorithms. Follow us on Twitter at ForgeandA for additional content and updates on the show. And of course, share this video and repost the stream. We are currently streaming on X, YouTube, and Rumble, so feel free to share that out and repost it. It really does help us get some reach, and you can send in your chats if you join us for the live stream. But that being said, let's get straight into it. So yeah, Wesley, like I mentioned in the opening, of course, most people by now have probably already seen that the Olympics has opened, and there was a large performance by a bunch of drag queens, clearly mimicking the Last Supper, of course, based off of the famous imagery that maybe some of the reform camp wouldn't be happy with the imagery of the famous painting, but either way, it's a Christian icon at this point that was being openly mocked. So you and I have talked privately about just the idea of culture warring and how Christians need to essentially just learn how to have the stomach for winning in the culture war. So that's, of course, what we're going to be talking about tonight. But maybe just start us off with, I guess, your initial reaction to seeing the craziness that came out of the Olympics.
Yeah. I mean, for us personally, I don't think I've ever owned cable in my life. And just as a family with kids and everything, we don't watch a lot of TV. So I wasn't sitting down on a Friday night, had the kids next to me and was like, oh my goodness. So I first saw it on X or Twitter. And I really it just felt par for the course. I remember seeing it. And it wasn't like, could this be real? Is this from an old Olympics? It was like, this would make sense. For one, it's being hosted in France, that gave us the gift of the French Revolution and many other wonderful things. But it just seems absolutely par for the course that the Olympics would open up with this. And they do it with this air of deniability. So I don't know if some of you may have seen the claim from some of the actors and those that participated was, no, this is an imagery of the Greek god Dionysus. So imagery of pleasure and of joy. And really what wasn't being done here was mocking Christians. This was an ancient Greek thing. And you have this fetish for persecution. That you think everything's persecuting you, everything is going after Christians. That's not the case. The lead actor herself, the woman, very large woman, sitting there in the center, she herself commented on Instagram, the gay New Testament, posting a picture of that Last Supper, that mockery, over and against the image of Da Vinci. I'm glad you said that, because I agree that we wouldn't have this problem of mocking images of Christ if we didn't have images of Christ in the first place. That commandment, I would at least hold that it forbids imaging the invisible God, and Christ, his divine attributes are not separated from his human attributes. But all that being said, it's mockery, and Christians for so long, they lay down and take it. They think the heights of piety, the heights of Christian discipleship and living is to lay down on the railroad, to die valiantly on the tracks and just get steamrolled, and that's good Christian living. But it's not. You are not virtuous because you are mocked and you are ridiculed and you do nothing about it. Now there is a place for the martyr. The Christians have been persecuted, and they still are today. And there's times where there's truly nothing that can be done. I don't know what percent Christians North Korea is, but if you're a Christian in North Korea, the Lord has ordained in his wisdom suffering, and there's not really a chance that you're going to take back the country, take back the culture. You're going to get your guys into office. But for the Christianity that conquered the West, I posted on X probably a couple days ago. I mean, the violent Viking tribes of Northern Europe, we conquered. Christianity vanquished the deities, the pagan Norse gods, the mythos of the violent Germanic peoples. Christianity then came to the New World. We kicked out the demons. I think it was John Doyle, he called them corn gods. So we conquered the old world, conquered its deities, its demons, all of those different things. We conquered the New World. But now this Christianity that did all of that built the greatest civilization the world has ever seen, now we have to lay down and we just have to take it as weak people, mock and taunt us. I don't think so. And so I hope, I saw what happened at the Olympics, but I hope it lights a fire under some Christians that they say, wait a second, I don't have to take this. They're picking on us. They wouldn't do that about Islam. I'm not saying Christians should mimic Islam, jihad, zealousness, but they wouldn't do it about Islam, because Islam, for all its faults, is a religion of strength. So Christianity needs to recapture some of that strength, and that's what we'll be talking about a little bit later.
Yeah, I completely agree, and we'll get into the details of that a little bit more thoroughly. Brian Hill in the chat said, "I've heard them trying to walk back that abomination with all kinds of excuses about how it shouldn't offend us." And although I absolutely don't regard the depiction of the Last Supper as being it looks like it cut off the last bit of your chat there, Brian. If you send the rest in, we'll read it out. There it is. Actual portrayal of Christ. We know who it's meant to portray, and therefore who they're aiming to make a mockery of. Yeah, and that kind of goes into the first point that you and I wanted to talk about, which is the idea of whether or not the battles that we face in modern day America as Christians is entirely spiritual. There are so many individuals that want to almost separate the material realities entirely and talk about things only in spiritual categories. And of course, we don't want to become full-blown materialists ourselves, but there is a ditch on both sides of the road. So talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair, so the Christian, I want to do my best to steelman the argument. So try to make the argument as they would make it, and then give what I think is a biblical rebuttal. But some of these Christians that would say, well, what you're doing and caring about these things and being engaged and taking, as we did, offense with the Olympics, these are kind of dealing on this flesh and blood material level. But Paul says in Ephesians chapter 6, I believe it's verse 12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in the high places. So they say, okay, you're engaged in this culture stuff, you care about legislation, you're trying to get people elected, you're preaching at pride parades, but Christian, don't you know that our battle isn't with flesh and blood. Paul says right here, our battle with principalities and powers and rulers and these spiritual things. For one, absolutely true. It's in the Bible. But just let's take it back a second. Okay, Paul wrote Ephesians 6. He also wrote 1 Timothy chapter 1, where he talks about handing over Hymenaeus and Alexander to Satan. So he knows the spiritual power, Hymenaeus and Alexander are blaspheming, but who does he turn over? The spirit, the principality of blaspheming? Does he? No, he hands over people. 1 Corinthians 6, when he executes church discipline. Again, so this person is, I'll just say it, he's a pervert. Paul doesn't hand over the spirit or the idea or the principality of perversion to be judged. He takes the person that Satan has captured to do his will and hands him as an individual over. So, and Paul is not schizophrenic. So he's not saying in Ephesians our battle is spiritual, but then when he actually is on the ground doing church discipline, doing apostolic ministry, contradicting everything he wrote to the church in Ephesians, it is spiritual at the highest level. How are these people motivated? How do these systems operate? Principalities, power, Satan, who hates the sons of light. But what does he take? Who does he employ in that work? Flesh and blood. If someone broke into your house, a demonically possessed man, you would not come downstairs and greet him and say, friend, my struggle is not with you. I know that you're possessed. I know the darkness that is in you. No, you would resist the person. And so when Christians, we can't fall for this idea that it's all spiritual. Yes, at the root of it, we wrestle against the world, against the flesh, and against the devil. And those are spiritual causes. It's spiritual idolatry in our flesh. It's the world, these principalities and powers. It's Satan, who is a real being, but they employ and they make use of the world. And what you notice too is God makes use of the world in resisting them. Every night with my family, I pray for God to protect us. Now, I don't pray, Lord, please protect our family as we sleep, and then leave my door unlocked and leave my gun unloaded. I lock my door. I take my gun. It's ready to go if something terrible were to happen. I've been trained to know how to use it. And then I pray, Lord, please protect us, knowing that the means that he has ordained ordinarily to protect us are these physical means. So we talk about the culture war and oh man, things are so dark and Satan's on the move. Okay, yes, he is. But as Christians, we have some weapons of spiritual warfare. Paul details those out in the armor of God. Absolutely. But then practically, okay, we pray for safety, but then we get to work with our hands and with our feet. We get to work preaching the gospel, worship as warfare, prayer and discipline as personal piety, but also building. And then when it comes to the point, legislating good laws, putting good men into office. Those are real means. Those are not carnal means, right? I think of Paul in Galatians where he says, like, having begun in the spirit, will I now finish by the flesh? So it's not as though, we could start in the spirit, but if we start using laws and coercion, this, that, or the other, to put restraints on evil, we're finishing in the flesh. Paul would never warn about that. He knew that, yes, there is this underneath of it all, but it employs flesh and blood. And so Christians have no out when they say, well, our battle is spiritual. I don't want to get involved in these things. I don't want to get entangled in the affairs of the world. No, they matter, and Christians should care about them.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned earlier the persecution complex that Christians are often accused of having. I believe that that's a real thing. Of course, I believe that there are Christians who really weren't being persecuted, especially in Aaron Ren's positive world or even in neutral world.
Yep.
And they maybe wanted to feign this persecution like it was so much worse for them than it is. But now that we have entered negative world and there is actual persecution taking place, thankfully we don't see mass rounding up of Christian individuals and a physical persecution necessarily going on. But of course, But of course, we see the signs that there is open mockery towards the Christian faith. There is open disdain towards Christianity. There are individuals who have been fired for holding Christian positions in their workplaces. So as persecution does become more prevalent, the other side of the coin that these same individuals usually use is then they say, well, it's a good thing that we're being persecuted because this will refine the church, and persecution always makes Christ's church stronger. And of course, I agree that some refining can make the church stronger. But these same individuals that want to say persecution complex, persecution complex, persecution complex, all the way up until the fact that there's undeniable persecution. Then they say, well, it's good that it's happening because this will refine the church. And at some point, there has to be a intervention that takes place where the church can wake up and realize that, yes, there's the beginnings of persecution are taking place. Let's see what we can do with the gifts God has given us to sort of turn the ship around and see if we can stop this from becoming an unmitigated disaster. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, my dad said it, but I thought it was really well said. People talk about that, like, well, it's persecution, and hey, it refines the church, and absolutely, like I said, North Korea, sometimes that does happen. But think of your kids, or think of you yourself being thrown in a jail cell or the gulag for being a Christian, and your roommate looks like someone who's in there doing hard time for murder. Okay, practically speaking, is that ideal or less ideal? Especially for your children. I would hope your children and your family would be those that you love most in this world. Of course, we love Christ and God most of all, but you love your family and love your children. And so then thinking about persecution, again, if it comes, it comes. But if you have a choice in it, if your resistance would matter here and now, such that your resistance could contribute to them living a better life, not being thrown in the gulag for their faith, not being persecuted, if those two options are on the table and you would actively choose to be persecuted, actively throw your hands up, can't get involved in this, I would actually say that's hateful towards your children. I'm going to strive so that my children, as they grow up, have the best opportunity to flourish as Christians, that they're not persecuted, that they're not fired for saying LGBTQ is synonymous with pedophilia, for example. I'm going to fight so that they can live out their Christian faith without being persecuted. And Paul himself, I mean, if you told him, I'm a time traveler from the year 450, and Rome is Christian and we're no longer persecuted, he would celebrate that. Like none of these apostles that we read and we love, and rightfully so, none of them would think of categories of, well, persecution, it's not persecution, not persecution, not persecution. Oh, it's happened. It's a good thing. Nothing we could have done about it. I don't think they would have thought in those categories. And so Christians shouldn't think in those categories either.
Yeah, I completely agree. So we're talking about Christian resistance and Christian strength. So let's talk a little bit about how strength has always been a part of Christianity. We, of course, can see this with historical accounts, everything from Lionheart to Boniface, to Saint Boniface. But it's rare to see in these days that we're living in now, to see an actual muscular Christianity active in the public square. So tell us more about why strength has always been a part of Christianity, and how that should be affecting the way we think of things in the modern day.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll counter with, for those of you that are maybe familiar with Owen Strachan, he's now senior director, I think, at the Dobson Cultural Center. So he tweeted about a month or so ago against Joel Webb, and just basically saying, new Christianity doesn't have a category for punishing our enemies. So to kind of set up the argument here. So the argument would be to those that would push back against what we're saying. Christianity has always had a muscular, strong aspect to it, that there are categories for running down your enemy, like we're talking about tonight, categories for winning, categories for dealing out punishment, because it's undeniable that's part of the Old Testament. Abraham was a good man, and he formed a rescue party and killed people to rescue his nephew Lot. Moses, personally, by his hand, killed an Egyptian, and then led through successive plagues and eventually rained down the Red Sea right on top of the Egyptians. Thousands of them killed. Moses, Joshua goes in. Men, women, and child that lived in these cities put to the sword. At God's demand, your eye shall not pity them. You shall not spare them. Samson, Gideon. Then you go into, you have David, a man after God's own heart. Took 200 foreskins in an afternoon. He was a man of the sword and of violence, and yet a man after God's own heart. Not the right man to build the temple. That's not a critique, I don't think, so much as God just saying you in your capacity were set apart as a warrior. And David, or Christ, is often described as the son of David. Then you have David, and then you have Josiah. So the whole Old Testament is full of kings, princes, rulers, even prophets. Elijah puts to the sword prophets of Baal. So you have this whole Old Testament where it's very clear that Old Testament Christianity has a strong, muscular edge to it, where the wicked, when they rise up, they do wicked things, they're quelled, not through democracy, not through voting, not through coercion, or not through persuasion, but through force. And so then the argument goes, okay, that's the Old Testament, but now in the New Testament, God relates to humanity in a different way. That in times past, he would wipe out the Canaanites, or in time past, wickedness would be banned and outlawed and kicked out of the land. But now in Christ, I think of John, for John chapter 1, where we have seen his grace, the only beloved of the Father, full of grace and truth. And so now, God in the past related with harshness, it was even violent, but now God relates to us in this manner of grace. And so Christians should no longer think or long for or look towards a Christian prince or a Christian king or someone strong that would lead us in the same way as the Old Testament, because the paradigm has changed. But as you mentioned, okay, so you have that Old Testament. That's about a period of 1,500 years that is written. You have the Judean occupation by Rome. I think that's about 70 BC, so 70 years before the birth of Christ. You have Christ, 30 years, Paul, I would say all scripture is written by 70 AD. And then you have about 150 years where you're correct. There are not Christian princes. Jesus did not come and rule a physical Judea with a physical sword at that time. Paul himself did not execute evildoers. So you do have this 150-year period where Christianity, and most of the New Testament is written, Christianity is much more of a martyrdom. It's persecution, and they're not in charge. But that fortune, so 1,500 years of the Old Testament, about 150, 200, 300 years, persecution, apostolic age, New Testament. But by 313, the Edict of Milan, Constantine, and then going into the Roman Empire, going into everything you just mentioned, we see the return of good, godly, strong rulers in the church age. So the person trying to make that argument that like the New Testament changes everything. For one, Jesus said, don't think I've come to abolish the law and prophets. So don't read Jesus as coming to abolish the Old Testament. But this Old Testament paradigm really almost continues. And we see the Crusaders take back the land conquered by the Muslims. And I know they weren't perfect, but it was good and right when you read how violent that they were. You read about King Alfred, you mentioned Braveheart. There's so many examples that we can see that the way God ordinarily works is through strong, good men that rule well, that protect their people. And they're capable of violence. Jordan Peterson says it a lot, but you're not virtuous if you're incapable of violence. If you are just someone that everyone would walk on top of, you're not virtuous. You're not capable of anything good. The virtuous man is the one who is capable of violence, but restrains it and saves it only for when it is due, in the proper proportion, in the right capacity. And so strength has always been a part of Christianity, and we can talk in terms like this. We can talk about war, we can talk about enemies, we can talk about winning, because that's how the church, that's how God's people have always had to think in a time of sin. Since the fall, the reality of sin means that there is wickedness and there is evil, and it's in our own hearts, yes, but it takes forms, and those forms can and should be resisted. And nothing about the New Testament changes, undoes that, retracts it, or modifies any of the way God relates to that sin.
Of course. Yeah. And I think that there are individuals, though, that may listen to what we're saying. And first of all, they might have immediately jump to some, over uncharitable assumption that we are, of course, calling for some sort of a violent Christian uprising. Obviously, we're not.
Nope.
We are talking about a defensive posture. Like you said, it's that imagery of a man whose house is broken into. He's ready, he's armed to the teeth, and he knows how to use it. But of course, he does not go out of his way looking for a fight. That's not how Christianity works. But of course, to talk again about strength in Christianity, to of course use Christ as our example. We do see where he created his own makeshift whip and was flipping tables and driving people out of the temple, and that's very confrontational. We see, calling out of religious leaders, calling them whitewashed tombs. We see these things that in modern day Christianity would be breaking the 11th commandment of thou shalt be nice. And we don't like that sort of thing. Yet we can see it from the life that Christ lived. So what we're ultimately calling for is, of course, not violence. We're not calling for a call to arms for Christians everywhere. Although spiritually we are, and of course we are talking about that. I would say to be public about your faith in a way that is bold, that is abiding by the law, but simultaneously is not afraid to push back against mockery. Um, and of course, we see you and I again talked about this privately about the individuals that have been fired recently after celebrating the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. We see Libs of TikTok was kind of going on a crusade of her own, documenting these people, and these individuals are starting to get confrontation at their workplace. We were seeing people. There's the viral video of a lady who works at Home Depot, a lady probably in her 40s, 50s, maybe even older. I don't know, a little hard to say. But she was fired from Home Depot because she was outright celebrating the fact that a Trump supporter died, as well as she was saying that she wished that the shooter had hit their mark and that President Trump was no longer on this earth. And of course, that is horrifying. That is disgusting, and we need to not be okay with that. But immediately we see so many individuals jumped to the defense of this woman because they're looking at this and these individuals are saying this is just like the left to Christianity, or this is just like the left towards conservatives. This is cancel culture, and we can't participate in the same thing. First of all, I think the threshold is completely different. I think individuals were canceled for desiring freedom. They were desiring a choice to choose what medical procedures they participated in, whether or not they had to wear a mask, whether or not they could open up their churches, whether or not they could see their loved ones who were dying alone in an elderly home. Those were the individuals that were getting fired for their jobs, or were getting, in some parts of the country, fined. Threatened with persecution by the state government in places like California. And then, of course, on the flip side, what we're seeing now currently is individuals that were openly celebrating and calling for violence getting fired. And I think that those thresholds are completely different. One is someone asking for their freedom. The other is someone asking for violence. So I think that if you can't notice the difference in those two, I think that you need to do some self-reflection on that.
The Christian conservative man wants the freedom to work and provide for his family. The leftist wants to see people dead in the street. Don't quite look the same to me.
Exactly. So we're talking about now, as I mentioned above in the intro, I do feel like there's been a shift recently. There's been a lot of great victories. I think there's many that we could point to. I know you and Joel did a whole episode talking a lot about that, so I won't rehash it all here. I'll just encourage them to go to Right Response Ministries and check out the live stream you guys did, talking about all the good things that are going on right now, everything from Elon freeing Twitter to allowing more free speech, and so many different things. Trump, of course, has been soaring in so many polls, but I won't belabor the point. All I'm getting at is we've actually seen some positive momentum in our direction for the first time in years, if not decades. And so the point you and I wanted to discuss is not pitying the enemy, as the title of our episode shows. So talk to us a bit about what you mean when you say that we should not pity the enemy.
Yeah, I'll just start with that Home Depot example. War is messy. I don't know if how many maybe saw All Quiet on the Western Front. It was a Netflix movie about World War II. And whatever the message aside, I just remember scenes where it's a young man and he's doing what it takes to survive. And some of the people he has to kill, it's not this glamorous or even clean shooting, artillery. It's hand-to-hand combat. It's suffocation. And that's what war is. War is so ugly. I did 4 years in the military. I was blessed to never see combat, but I hear the stories, and I would meet people who did combat in Iraq and stuff like that. What you have to get through is when people are threatening your way of life, the response that even is proportional and measured, it's not going to look dignified and beautiful. And so, yes, a 40-year-old woman has to lose her job and file for unemployment and struggle to be employed. And like you mentioned, some Christians and more conservatives, I would say, than Christians, they started to get pity. Well, we can't use the same tactics that are being used on us. How well would that work if you lined up the artillery against the enemy and said, "Well, hang on, guys. If we do this, we'll be just like them. If we fire artillery and they fire artillery at us, well, wouldn't we look just like we're doing the same thing as the enemy?" And the reality is we have to do the same thing as the enemy and do it better when it comes to winning a culture war. So culture wars, we do them so we don't have to do physical violence, right? So politics is so that we can triage things and we can get through problems without having to resort to dueling in the town square. But when we do this culture war, there's casualties of it. I think of Daniel Perry, a Marine who protected individuals on a subway from a man who was threatening them, and the man passed away. Well, he's in jail right now, or at the very least out on bond, facing charges for murder because the optics of a white man restraining a black man on the subway who was having what the left would probably call a mental health crisis didn't work. He was a good man, virtuous, protecting others, and he's rotting in jail right now. So the culture war, it has its prisoners, it has its victims. How many men, how many fathers lost their jobs and killed themselves during COVID, or maybe got the vaccine and collapsed dead a week later? So we're talking about war and we're talking about victims, and so you don't get out of it. The way out is the way through. The way out is to win. We're in the mess we are because of sins upon sins upon sins, and when you do all of that, when you sin to a great degree, the way back is not short. If you need to go north, but you go south 50 miles and you realize, oh my goodness, I've been heading south, I've been confused, I have to head north, you have to retrace the whole 50 miles that you went south. And so we've stacked decades upon decades upon decades of feminism, but I would also add sexual liberation, a leaving of Christianity and religion as the basis for public life. So we left all of those things and we're reaping the fruit of it. But the way back is not going to be pretty. When you sin again and again and again, it's costly. And so we're turning the ship. And what that's going to mean is dealing with the fruit and not dealing with some of it, not turning a mile and going a mile north for this illustration and saying, isn't that far enough? Isn't that enough ground that I've retraced? You have to go back and you have to retrace all of it. And you have to fix the error that got you here in the first place. I think of the 19th Amendment. I don't know your views on that, but I would hold that it was erroneous, that it was not even women themselves, for the most part, didn't even want the right to vote, but men gave it to them. So you've got to go all the way back, and you have to fix that. You have to fix the idea that a woman can murder her child in the womb. And the point is, we're not even close to those victories. We're here. We're okay. America is a nation. Free speech is important. Christianity is the religion of the United States. Borders are necessary. We're establishing these foundational principles, and for conservatives that have been used to not winning, this can feel like great progress. Look at this. We've got a strong border. We've established a bit of a national identity. There's no more war on Christmas, right? Starbucks is back to saying Merry Christmas. We did it, guys. No, that's 1% of the distance that we have to come back to true repentance. And the temptation, I'll use examples from military history. There's a lot of examples. The Battle of Bull Run. So this was very early in the Civil War, the first real battle. The Southerns routed the North, and Jackson said, "Give me an army, give me 10,000 men, and I'll take Washington." And historians think they probably would have won the Civil War that day. I'm not advocating that the South should have won, but I'm saying that they had an early advantage, and they didn't press it. Same thing in the Korean War. So the Korean War, the Soviet-backed North Korean forces pushed all the way down to the south. The UN enters the war. They push them back. And what happens is the Chinese surround the Marine First Division at the Chosin Reservoir. They had 120,000 troops to about 30,000. They had numbers. They had resources. They had firepower. They had them surrounded. They didn't have the will to finish the conflict. And it was called the UN 10th Corps. The US 10th Corps escaped. They managed to continue fighting the war. And it came back to dog them. Hitler at Dunkirk refused to kill, finish off something like, I think it was 300,000 British soldiers at the beach. Again, it came back to haunt them. Over and over again, we see in military history, in war, we're in a culture war right now, again and again, the principle is when you have the advantage and you've turned the tide, It's costly to keep pressing it. For the Chinese to finish off the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, to assault DC at the Battle of Bull Run following up from that, to seal the deal at Dunkirk, it would have been costly. It would have cost men. It would have cost resources. It would have cost time. But how much more did that decision haunt them and cost them later on when they escaped, when they refueled? We could win. We could take back some time, some ground right now. But if you don't finish the job, you know what we're going to be doing in 10 years? The same battle. The left could realize they've overplayed their hand. They could take a couple hits, maybe lose an election. But we don't just have to get back to 2015, 2016, or 2000. There's so much more that we have to undo. And so my exhortation, the reason we're talking today, is that we go to the Bible for what our society should look like. And if we're not there, we've got to keep pushing. We have to keep taking ground. We have to keep saying no to things. Speaking practically, universities, Christian universities, they have to, if they've realized they've been compromised, it might be 75% of your staff. It might be cutting entire programs. I would hold that a seminary, Reformed seminary especially, should not admit women. Well, that means you might have to cut your counseling program because men aren't taking it. You have to cut programs. You have to cut personnel. It means churches have to cut children's church because children should be with their parents and worshiping with the family. That would be my conviction, at least. And that's just within Christianity, within the church. That's not even talking about the civil sphere at the state level. And so in all of this, it might be multi-generational, doing the hard work, repenting, and then repenting in deed too. It's not repenting in word. Oh man, that's bad. Something should be done about it. It's then going and doing something about it. Like you said, not as vigilantes, not as lone actors, but as Christians, taking positions of power in society and working by God's grace, empowered by the Holy Spirit, to regain ground, and to regain a lot of ground, and to do so, not thinking this is going to be done in 2 years. If it took 150 years for this rot to get as deep as it's gotten and go as far as it's gotten, don't be surprised if it takes at least half that time to undo the bulk of it.
Yeah, exactly. And to give another couple of practical examples, because again, since we've been talking warfare, I know that I know that Right Wing Watch is probably already clipping this, saying that we're calling for something that we're not. Which hi, by the way, if you're watching, we love you. Feel free to blast this out to whoever. Right Wing Watch, we appreciate the promotion. But more practical examples. Roe v. Wade, prime example. Roe v. Wade, it was overturned. Praise God, that was a good thing. Of course, the Dobbs decision, I think, was it could have been much, much better. I think there was a lot of iniquities that were kind of codified by that decision, which is unfortunate. But either way, it was still at least movement in the right direction. Well, now we saw the pro-life movement completely caught flat-footed, and of course that's because many of them are grifters anyways, but those of us who are serious, they were still caught flat-footed and unable to actually garner any massive wins at the state level after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And so that's something where we need to press the advantage. The moment that we see the momentum on our side, we need to press the advantage. So we can hope that states like Florida can defeat the awful abortion legislation that's going to be voted on in November in their state as well. And then another example to talk a little bit more specific to my audience in the SBC, the law amendment. This is a prime example of something that took place in the SBC. And I, of course, covered this in greater detail with Jared Moore, the last episode he was on for. But First Church Alexandria was a woman pastor affirming church that was disfellowshipped by the SBC. And that conveniently happened right before the vote on the law amendment took place. And so Jared and many others believe that that vote was called and placed in such a way that many individuals would see that we can hold churches accountable without the law amendment passing. And I would not be shocked if there were several individuals who decided to not press the advantage when it comes to the the SBC voting on the law amendment. And so now we will probably have to readdress this exact same issue in a few years' time, if not at the very next annual meeting. I don't know exactly if there's going to be a similar push to basically resurrect the law amendment as it was worded, but either way, we are going to have to deal with this woman pastor issue in the SBC now, because even though I believe it was 80% voted for the law amendment the first year, the second year that was required to also pass in order for the amendment to actually be taken up, we got 61. So press the advantage. And that is just another example within the realm of the SBC where we could see Christians not wanting to fight, not wanting to get uncomfortable. Ultimately, all they've done is they've put off that battle to another day. And it's another day where we might have less allies, because I know there are many individuals who left the SBC as a result of the law amendment not passing. And I pray that those individuals will come back. If you're unconvinced, listen to that episode I did with Jared. Jared had some great arguments for why you should stay in the SBC. The quick summary is mostly because the SBC can't tell you hardly anything about how you can run your church. It's really almost a no-cost battle to be involved in. But either way, the point still stands. When we decided to not press the advantage in the SBC, all that's happened is that we were going to be facing that exact same battle probably in the coming couple years in the SBC, just like the pro-lifers who did not have a plan ready for the moment that Roe v. Wade is overturned because they thought it was impossible. Well, suddenly it became possible, and we were not ready with any ground game in the states to actually abolish abortion in its entirety. But feel free to riff on any of that, Wesley.
No, those are great examples. And pro-life, it really just betrayed that they didn't want to go all the way back. Or end Roe v. Wade, they're like, we'll dedicate all our effort to that. Oh, but equal protection for the child, that they have the same right. Oh, but that's not a fight we're willing to take up. And that was crushing the law amendment defeat by such a close margin too. So you mentioned like the way the vote was arranged. Pity can really be a drug. Like you can feel so gracious and merciful and empathetic when you show pity. But there's thinking categorically. There's times that you can't show pity. In Deuteronomy, multiple times it's repeated when it talks about justice. And one of the justice is when a woman interferes in an argument with a man and grabs him inappropriately, that her hand is to be cut off. That's in God's law. That's in Deuteronomy. And it's followed up immediately. Your eye shall not pity. You shall do justice. That's God saying, I know this is going to be a hard one to enforce. Do not make the mistake in this realm of justice in doing anything less than what the law requires. So there are times, absolutely. I think of with our children. There's a time for mercy, maybe, when they recognize what they've done wrong. But there's other places, and church governance like the SBC is just not one of them. You can feel so righteous, you can feel so gracious, and you can do like, oh, look, we kicked out this FBC church. We don't really need to go all the way. We don't need to root all of these out. Some of these are African-American churches, and we wouldn't want to lose her. And you can feel so good about yourself. But really what you've done is violated what God requires. You've shown this pity. And like you said, exactly, you just prolonged a fight that has to be done. And worse, sometimes lost the battle. Don't give in to the pity drug. It's like a drug. Stay off of it. And there are times. That is not to say there are not times for mercy and for grace, for compassion, for a Joe Rigney calls it a tethered empathy, a compassion, and that is grounded, that is measured in the right proportion, in the right category, in the right time. But for babies being murdered in the womb, for holding the biblical standard in the office of elder, that is not the time to dust off the jacket, to feel righteous, to pat yourself on the back and say, well, we could have been just, but we chose to be merciful.
Well said. I think that's a great place to leave it. So we'll wrap up there. But Wesley, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're involved in?
So you can find me on Twitter, banging out great tweets. It would be at 1689er, so 1689er, Neo-Orthodox Disrespecter is the name there. And then Right Response, live stream on Wednesdays, as well as Method Ministries. We do, it's called the Layman's Lounge. By myself, I'm a layman. I don't hold any church office. So I do that with Lucas Curcio. And those episodes typically come out on Wednesdays as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us, Wesley. And thank you, listener, for joining us as well. Feel free to go on over to our Substack, forgeandanvil.substack.com. Go ahead and put in your email. It is free. Of course, there is a paid option if you want to throw a tip in the tip jar. But either way, we appreciate your support. And of course, share this video far and wide. We really appreciate it. And until then, we'll see you next time.